Part 2, Chapter 1, Footnote. There is no special code of statute laws either in the United States or Great Britain for the maintenance of discipline or the provisioning and treatment of the crews of trading ships when beyond the precincts of Admiralty jurisdiction. But certain usages on these points have by long custom become established and recognized by courts of justice. It is very desirable that a comprehensive code should be devised and compiled, so as to set disputed points at rest. For although a general rule is admitted by the mariners of both countries, it is by no means a universal one, the custom varying in different trades according to circumstances. And this is more particularly the case in the merchant service of this country than in that of the United States, the discipline being more stringent and distinctions of rank more rigidly observed by the Republicans than ourselves. The duties of each rating described in this chapter appear to be well defined and worthy of imitation. Our ship owners and masters would, therefore, do well to adopt them, with such modifications as may be necessary to suit particular trades. And this may be done by inserting a clause to that effect, in the form of agreement now required to be entered into between master and crew before proceeding on a voyage, described at Schedules B and D of 5 and 6 W 4, Cap 19. The master. Beginning of the voyage. Shipping the crew. Outfit. Provisions. Watches. Navigation. Logbook. Observations. Working ship. Day's work. Discipline. In the third part of this work, it will be seen that the shipmaster is a person to whom, both by the general marine law of all commercial nations and by the special statutes of the United States, great powers are confided, and upon whom heavy responsibilities rest. The shipmaster will find there what are his legal rights, duties, and remedies as to owner, ship and crew, and the various requirements as to the papers with which he is to furnish his ship, and the observances of revenue and other regulations. It is proposed to give here, rather more perhaps for the information of others than of the master himself, the ordinary and everyday duties of his office, and the customs which long usage has made almost as binding as laws. There is a great difference in different ports, and among the various owners, as to the part the master is to take in supplying and manning the vessel. In many cases the owner puts on board all the stores for the ship's use and for the crew, and gives the master particular directions, sometimes in writing, as to the manner in which he is to dispense them. These directions are more or less liberal, according to the character of the owner, and in some cases the dispensing of the stores is left to the master's discretion. In other instances, the master makes out an inventory of all the stores he thinks it expedient to have put on board, and they are accordingly supplied by the owner's order. In the manner of shipping the crew, there is as great a difference as in that of providing the stores. Usually, the whole thing is left to shipping masters, who are paid so much a head for each of the crew, and are responsible for their appearance on board at the time of sailing. When this plan is adopted, neither the master nor owner, except by accident, knows anything of the crew before the vessel goes to sea. The shipping master opens the articles at his office, procures the men, sees that they sign in due form, pays them their advance, takes care that they, or others in their place, are on board at the time of sailing, and sends in a bill for the whole to the owner. In other cases, the master selects his crew, and occasionally the owner does it, if he has been at sea himself, and understands seamen, though a shipping master is still employed to see them on board, and for other purposes. Footnote. In the British service, the practice is for owners of vessels going on voyages round the Cape of Good Hope to employ an agent, generally called a crimp, to engage the greatest part of the crew. If 40 or 50 men are wanted, double that number are brought on board, out of which the chief mate selects a sufficient company. The agent then receives a note for 2 months' wages, which he has, for the most part, advanced to the seaman, either in cash or slops, clothes, and also his procuration fee, varying from 5 shillings to 20 shillings per man, if he have not engaged to provide the crew for a specified sum. In the ordinary course of short voyages, where crews are shipped frequently, and there is not much motive for making a selection, the procuring a crew may be left entirely to the agency of a faithful shipping master. But upon long voyages, the comfort and success of which may depend much upon the character of a crew, the master or owner should interest himself to select able-bodied and respectable men, to explain to them the nature and length of the voyage they are going upon, what clothing they will want, and the work that will be required of them, and should see that they have proper and sufficient accommodations and provisions for their comfort. The master or owner should also, though this duty is often neglected, go to the forecastle and see that it is cleaned out, whitewashed, or painted, and put in a proper habitable condition, and furnished with every reasonable convenience. It would seem best that the master should have something to do with the selection of the provisions for his men, as he will usually be more interested in securing their goodwill and comfort than the owner would be. By the master or owners thus interesting himself for the crew, a great deal of misunderstanding, complaint, and ill will may be avoided, and the beginning, at least, of the voyage be made under good auspices. Unless the master is also supercargo, his duties, before sailing, are mostly confined to looking after the outfit of the vessel, and seeing that she is in sea order. Everything being in readiness, the custom house and other regulations complied with, and the crew on board, the vessel is put under the charge of the pilot to be carried out clear of the land. While the pilot is on board, the master has little else to do than to see that everything is in order, and that the commands of the pilot are executed. As soon as the pilot leaves the ship, the entire control and responsibility are thrown upon the master. When the vessel is well clear of the land and things are put into some order, it is usual for the master to call all hands aft, and say something to them about the voyage upon which they have entered. After this, the crew are divided into watches. The watches are the divisions of the crew into 2 equal portions. The periods of time occupied by each part of the crew while on duty are also called watches. There are 2 watches, the larboard, commanded by the chief mate, and the starboard, by the second mate. The master himself stands no watch, but comes and goes at all times, as he chooses. The starboard is sometimes called the captain's watch, probably from the fact that in the early days of the service, when vessels were smaller, there was usually but one mate, and the master stood his own watch. And now, in vessels which have no second mate, the master keeps the starboard watch. In dividing into watches, the master usually allows the officers to choose the men, one by one, alternately, but sometimes makes the division himself, upon consulting with his officers. The men are divided as equally as possible, with reference to their qualities as able seamen, ordinary seamen, or boys, as all green hands are called, whatever their age may be. But if the number is unequal, the larboard watch has the odd one, since the chief mate does not go aloft and do other duty in his watch, as the second mate does in his. The cook always musters with the larboard watch, and the steward with the starboard. If there is a carpenter and the larboard watch is the largest, he generally goes aloft with the starboard watch, otherwise with the larboard. As soon as the division is made, if the day's work is over, one watch is set, and the other is sent below. Among the numerous customs of the ocean, which can hardly be accounted for, it is one that on the first night of the outward passage the starboard watch should take the first 4 hours on deck, and on the first night of the homeward passage the larboard watch should do the same. The sailors explain this by the old phrase that the master takes the ship out and the mate takes her home. The master takes the bearing and distance of the last point of departure upon the land, and from that point the ship's reckoning begins, and is regularly kept in the logbook. The chief mate keeps the logbook, but the master examines and corrects the reckoning every day. The master also attends to the chronometer, and takes all the observations, with the assistance of his officers, if necessary. Every day, a few minutes before noon, if there is any prospect of being able to get the sun, the master comes upon deck with his quadrant or sextant, and the chief mate also usually takes his. The second mate does not, except upon a Sunday, or when there is no work going forward. As soon as the sun crosses the meridian, 8 bells are struck, and a new sea day begins. The reckoning is then corrected by the observation under the master's superintendence. The master also takes the lunar observations, usually with the assistance of both his officers, in which case the master takes the angle of the moon with the star or sun, the chief mate takes the altitude of the sun or star, and the second mate the altitude of the moon. In regulating the hours of duty and sleep, the meal times, the food, etc., the master has absolute power. Yet the customs are very nearly the same in all vessels. The hour of breakfast is 7 bells in the morning, half after 7, dinner at noon, and supper whenever the day's work is over. If the voyage is a long one, the crew are usually put upon an allowance of bread, beef, and water. The dispensing of the stores and regulating of the allowance lies, of course, with the master, though the duty of opening the casks, weighing, measuring, etc., falls upon the second mate. The chief mate enters in the logbook every barrel or cask of provisions that is broached. The steward takes charge of all the provisions for the use of the cabin, and keeps them in the pantry, over which he has the direct control. The average of allowance in merchant vessels is 6 pounds of bread a week, and 3 quarts of water, and 1.5 pounds of beef, or 1 1/4 of pork, a day to each man. Footnote. For want of some fixed scale of allowance in the British merchant service, great discontent frequently arises on the part of the crew, particularly on long voyages. In coasting vessels, where the work is hard and constant, the allowance of beef and bread is unlimited. But on long voyages it would be well to adopt the scale established for the Royal Navy, which is found amply sufficient, and this should form part of the contract, and be entered as a special clause in the Articles of Agreement. On the next page is the scale alluded to. In trading, as well as the Queen's vessels, excisable articles are allowed in sufficient quantity for the voyage out and home, duty-free. This regulation, as regards spirits, coffee, tea, etc., places our shipowners on a par with foreigners in the cost of outfit as to these articles. But they still have to complain that the principal stores of provision, such as beef, pork, and bread, are considerably dearer in this country than abroad, a disadvantage which presses heavily on the British shipowners in their competition with foreigners. Table. Proportion for 14 days. Pounds bread, 14. Gallons beer, 14. Ounces sugar, 21. Ounces cocoa, 14. Ounces tea, 3.5. Pounds beef, 5 1/4. Pounds pork, 5 1/4. Pounds flour, 5 1/4. Pints peas, 3.5. Pints oatmeal, 1. Pints vinegar, 1. The entire control of the navigation and working of the ship lies with the master. He gives the course and general directions to the officer of the watch, who enters upon a slate, at the end of the watch, the course made, and the number of knots, together with any other observations. The officer of the watch is at liberty to trim the yards, to make alterations in the upper sails, to take in and set royals, topgallant sails, etc. But no important alteration can be made, as for instance, reefing a topsail, without the special order of the master, who, in such cases, always comes upon deck and takes command in person. When on deck, the weather side of the quarter-deck belongs to him, and as soon as he appears, the officer of the watch will always leave it, and go over to leeward, or forward into the waist. If the alteration to be made is slight, the master usually tells the officer to take in or set such a sail, and leaves to him the particular ordering as to the braces, sheets, etc., and the seeing all things put in their place. The principal maneuvers of the vessel, as tacking, wearing, reefing, topsail, getting under way, and coming to anchor, require all hands. In these cases the master takes command, and gives his orders in person, standing upon the quarter-deck. The chief mate superintends the forward part of the vessel, under the master, and the second mate assists in the waist. The master never goes aloft, nor does any work with his hands, unless for his own pleasure. If the officer of the watch thinks it necessary to reef the topsails, he calls the master, who, upon coming on deck, takes command, and, if he thinks proper, orders all hands to be called. The crew, officers and all, then take their stations and await the orders of the master, who works the ship in person, giving all the commands, even the most minute, and looks out for trimming the yards and laying the ship for reefing. The chief mate commands upon the forecastle, under the master, and does not go aloft. The second mate goes aloft with the crew. In tacking and wearing, the master gives all the orders as to trimming the yards, etc., through the chief mate, though the chief mate is expected to look out for the head yards. So, in getting under way and in coming to anchor, the master takes the entire personal control of everything, the officers acting under him in their several stations. In the ordinary day's work, however, which is carried on in a vessel, the state of things is somewhat different. This the master does not superintend personally, but gives general instructions to the chief mate, whose duty it is to see to their execution. To understand this distinction, the reader will bear in mind that there are two great divisions of duty and labor on shipboard. One, the working and navigating of the vessel, that is, the keeping and ascertaining the ship's position, and directing her course, the making and taking in sail, trimming the sails to the wind, and the various nautical maneuvers and evolutions of a vessel. The other branch is the work done upon the hull and rigging to keep it in order, such as the making and fitting of new rigging, repairing of old, etc., all which, together with making of small stuffs to be used on board, constitute the day's work and jobs of the crew. As to the latter, the master usually converses with the chief mate upon the state of the vessel and rigging, and tells him, more or less particularly, what he wishes to have done. It then becomes the duty of this officer to see the thing accomplished. If, for instance, the master tells the chief mate to stay the topmast more forward, the chief mate goes upon the forecastle, sets the men to work, one upon one thing and another upon another, sees that the stays and backstays are come up with, has tackles got upon the rigging, sights the mast, etc. If the master sees anything which he disapproves of, and has any preference in the modes of doing the work, he should call the officer aft and speak to him, and if, instead of this, he were to go forward and give orders to the men, it would be considered an interference, and indeed an insult to the officer. Footnote. This is not sufficiently attended to in British merchant ships. The master should consider that a contrary course lessens the authority of his chief officer over the crew, and eventually his own. So with any other work doing upon the ship, or rigging, as rattling down, turning in, and setting up rigging, bending and unbending sails, and all the knotting, splicing, serving, etc., and the making of small stuffs, which constitute the day's work and jobs of a vessel. If the chief officer is a competent man, the master is not expected to trouble himself with the details of any of these things, and indeed, if he were to do so to a great extent, it would probably lead to difficulty. Where there are passengers, as in regular line of packet ships, or as they are familiarly called, liners, between New York and Liverpool or Havre, for instance, the master has even less to do with the day's work, since the navigation and working of the ship, with proper attention to his passengers, are as much as can reasonably be required of him. The master has the entire control of the cabin. The mates usually live in a stateroom by themselves, or if they live in the cabin, they yet feel that the master is the head of the house, and are unwilling to interfere with his hours and occupations. The chief mate dines with the master, and the second mate looks out for the ship while they are below, and dines at the second table. In the liners, however, the mates dine together, and the master looks out for the ship while they are at dinner, and dines with his passengers at a later hour. As the master stands no watch, he comes and goes as he pleases, and takes his own hours for rest. In fine weather, he is not necessarily much on deck, but should be ready at all times, especially in bad weather, to be up at a moment's notice. Everything of importance that occurs, as the seeing a sail or land, or the like, must be immediately reported to the master, and in heaving to for speaking, the master takes the entire charge of working the vessel, and speaks the other sail in person. As will be found in the third part of this book, the master has the entire control of the discipline of the ship, and no subordinate officer has authority to punish a seaman or to use force without the master's order, except in cases of necessity not admitting of delay. He has also the complete direction of the internal arrangements and economy of the vessel, and upon his character, and upon the course of conduct he pursues, depend in a great measure the character of the ship and the conduct of both officers and men. He has a power and an influence, both direct and indirect, which may be the means of much good or much evil. If he is profane, passionate, tyrannical, indecent, or intemperate, more or less of the same qualities will spread themselves or break out among officers and men, which perhaps would have been checked, if not in some degree removed, had the head of the ship been a man of high personal character. He may make his ship almost anything he chooses, and may render the lives and duties of his officers and men pleasant and profitable to them, or may introduce disagreements, discontent, tyranny, resistance, and in fact make the situation of all on board as uncomfortable as that in which any human beings can well be placed. Every master of a vessel who will lay this to heart and consider his great responsibility may not only be a benefactor to the numbers whom the course of many years will bring under his command, but may render a service to the whole class, and do much to raise the character of the calling.